I think it's
okay, but I remember very well we had this communication.
Yes.
Some music, maybe your son.
Yeah. So I'm glad you are here.
Yeah. I realized when
I think it's all the ministers.
yes, but Gabriele kept talking about you. Do you remember about the visit, and I then registered that we had met before. Email.
Good. I'm really glad to
Yeah, I'm glad to
meet
be
you
back.
and to hear you. Will be great.
Luckily, these are small screens because with Gabriele we went to China together. Last time, I mean, not all, but some huge. My skills in putting images are terrible, so I stopped doing that.
Chloe,
Yes,
you saw the names here?
of course.
Yeah, wonderful.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos, sejam todas muito bem-vindas a este quarto Summer School Nufa Archai, que integra aqui o nosso reunião do Fórum Permanente de Estudos Clássicos, Direito e História do Direito, presidido pelo desembargador Gustavo, Direito. É uma honra muito grande recebê-los e recebê-las aqui presencialmente e também através das nossas redes sociais, em especial aqueles que estão conosco através do Zoom e também ao vivo na EMERJ TV no YouTube. Eu quero dizer que é uma honra enorme para a Escola da Magistratura do Rio de Janeiro participar desse programa, junto com a UNB, com a PUC-Rio, com todas as entidades, o programa de pós-graduação da Universidade de Brasília, o CNPq, enfim, todas as entidades que integram essa programação e, em especial, um agradecimento muito afetuoso ao querido amigo, professor, doutor Gustavo, Direito. Agradeço também a parceria e agora também do nosso professor, doutor Gabriele, Cornelli, e a parceria também fundamental do doutor Renato Matoso Brandão. E, de modo especial, é uma alegria enorme receber a professora doutora Balla aqui conosco para esta atividade e essa oportunidade que temos de aperfeiçoamento das questões vinculadas ao direito e à filosofia. Portanto, eu diria que é uma reunião transcendental, é uma reunião que ultrapassa as fronteiras do direito, ultrapassa as fronteiras geográficas para termos aqui a professora da Universidade de Creta, a professora doutora Balla. Então, é uma honra muito grande e estamos todos ansiosos com as aulas que serão ministradas E eu externo mais uma vez os agradecimentos a toda a equipe da EMERJ, a todos os nossos colaboradores, os intérpretes de Libras que aqui estão permitindo que o evento seja compreendido por pessoas que tenham necessidades específicas, a nossa tradução simultânea, enfim, todos que possibilitam a realização deste evento. E eu passo a coordenação e a direção dos trabalhos daqui por diante ao professor, doutor, desembargador Carlos Gustavo Direito, que preside o Fórum Permanente de Estudos Clássicos, Direito e História da EMERJ. Muito obrigado a todos e a todas e tenhamos um excelente evento.
Bom, liga aqui.
Tá ligado, tá ligado.
Boa tarde a todos. Muito obrigado ao nosso diretor, Cláudio Orto, que tem feito um trabalho muito ativo na Escola da Magistratura para permitir esse diálogo interdisciplinar. Aqui, como os senhores sabem, e as senhoras, é uma escola de juiz, né? Prepara para os juízes e depois prepara os juízes, né? No concurso público, após ser aprovado como magistrado, o futuro juiz fica 4 meses na escola estudando até poder exercer a sua função judicante. E uma batalha que nós temos muito grande é trazer um pouco a filosofia, aqui no caso especificamente a filosofia antiga, mas também a história, e todas essas matérias afins, sociologia, antropologia, mas aqui especificamente no nosso fórum, a filosofia antiga e a história antiga, para dentro do universo dos magistrados, né? Então, é muito emblemático para nós fazer um summer school em filosofia antiga dentro da Escola da Magistratura. Tem um significado muito importante para nós como um marco e que nós pretendemos desenvolver sempre, fazendo esse diálogo permanente. Nós vamos ter uma semana toda com a presença da professora Balla, que muito nos honra estar aqui presente, professora da Universidade de Creta, o professor Gabriele, que fez a organização pela Archai, o professor Renato Matoso, pela PUC, e o nosso objetivo é manter esse diálogo permanente através do fórum, realizando eventos e eventos um pouco mais longos, um pouco mais curtos, para poder trabalharmos especificamente, como o Cláudio Orto falou, essa metafísica do direito e da filosofia, né? Porque o direito, ele de certa forma, ele tem esse lado metafísico também. E pela escola, eu e o Gabriele estamos fazendo a tradução sobre as leis de Cícero, né? Uma pesquisa específica pela Escola da Magistratura, núcleo, né? Um núcleo de estudos da Escola da Magistratura. Ou seja, nós estamos cada vez mais nos aproximando da história e da filosofia antiga com a nossa contemporaneidade. O objetivo é esse. Eu vou passar a palavra tanto para o Gabriele como para o professor Renato para falar essa introdução e depois eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Chloe. Eu vou só ler rapidamente o currículo da professora. A professora Chloe, com quem eu tive a felicidade de encontrar em Atenas, tive a felicidade de estarmos juntos em Atenas. Ela é professora de filosofia antiga na Universidade de Creta, diretora do Laboratório de Pesquisa e Tradução Filosófica da UCRC e presidente do Centro de Civilizações Antigas Gregas e Chinesas, o CELCIP. Publicou extensivamente sobre os sofistas, o corpus hipocrático e os diálogos de Platão. É autora de Platonic Persuasion from Rhetoric to Statecraft, em Atenas, The Sophist and Socrates, em Atenas também, de Atenas 2023, em coautoria com Calope Papamanoli, uma tradução para o grego moderno da Constituição dos Atenienses de Aristóteles. Publicou The Philosopher in Antiquity, também recentemente. Ela foi pesquisadora associada do Centro de Estudos Helênicos, Universidade de Harvard, do Centro Sear de Estudos Helênicos da Universidade de Princeton e do Instituto Israelense de Estudos Avançados. Professora Chloe, é um prazer tê-la aqui conosco, é uma honra para nós tê-la durante toda a semana ministrando cursos e trazendo debates sobre o pensamento platônico, a contemporaneidade e a filosofia antiga. Então, passo a palavra para o professor Gabriele para fazer as suas palavras introdutórias.
Muito obrigado, querido amigo e colega Gustavo. Quero também agradecer mais uma vez a acolhida professor Cláudio del Orto, dessa casa. Eu já me sinto em casa aqui, já sou da casa, mas me sinto também muito bem acolhido. A gente não costuma, no nosso ambiente, ter uma acolhida tão elegante, funcional, né, como esta da escola. Então, as nossas universidades públicas, elas sofrem com falta de investimentos, etc., e esta acolhida é especialmente querida também por causa disso, né? Essa equipe toda que está nos acolhendo. Me permitam só fazer um brevíssimo histórico. O que são essas Summer Schools, né? O que a gente fez nesses anos? Essa é a 4ª Summer School que estamos fazendo, desta vez em parceria com o Nufa, e com a EMERJ, claro, né? O Núcleo de Estudos de Filosofia Antiga da PUC-Rio, aqui na EMERJ e com a EMERJ. E essas Summer School foram pensadas sempre como encontros em que, por uma semana, a gente convidava alguém, normalmente um colega nosso do exterior, para dar um curso para a gente, né? Num ambiente bastante tranquilo, relaxado, em que a gente pudesse ter tempo para conversar, etc. E o único critério é que ele tinha que ser perto do mar, da água. Então fizemos em Salvador, com Giovanni Casertano, depois fizemos em Florianópolis com Alberto Bernabé, fizemos o ano passado, Rafael Pitt, veio lá em Macapá, que é mar e Amazonas, né, e Rio ao mesmo tempo, com a vinda do Raul Gutierrez e da Elisabetta Catani, e finalmente conseguimos trazer a professora Chloe Balla aqui. Eu acho que a 5ª vai ser aqui também, porque essa acolhida é maravilhosa, mas a gente conversa depois. Já está marcado.
Vamos deixar marcado.
Eu quero contar também um pouquinho desse núcleo que o desembargador e professor Gustavo, aqui Direito, tem liderado, que é o Núcleo de Pesquisa de Filosofia e Direito Comparado, que é uma invenção, de fato, uma criação, essa ideia de trazer a filosofia e os estudos clássicos dentro dessa discussão do Gustavo. Isso eu quero registrar, de fato, não somente o empenho, mas a qualidade do investimento que a EMERJ, através do Gustavo, está fazendo nesses temas. Vocês têm no site uma programação quase bimensal, né, de atividades aqui, sempre de estudos clássicos, de filosofia, etc. A professora Beatriz de Paula está participando também dessas atividades aqui. Então, de fato, aqui a EMERJ e o núcleo estão se tornando um lugar de evidência para os estudos clássicos, né? Uma novidade dessa 4ª Summer School é essa parceria com a EMERJ, mas também a parceria com o Renato Matoso e o Nufa. Não sei se todo mundo... Bom, quem é do Rio sabe muito bem o que é o Nufa, né? Mas talvez o pessoal de fora menos. O Nufa é um núcleo de estudos de filosofia antiga, um dos mais tradicionais e antigos do Brasil, né? Sediado na PUC, com a professora Irley também está aqui, da PUC, junto conosco. E é, de fato, uma coisa que a nós da Archai nos deixa muito felizes, essa parceria. É uma parceria que foi construída ao longo de muitos anos, né? E, finalmente, ela está vindo, digamos assim, no papel escrita, né? Archai/Nufa, aliás, Nufa/Archai, né? Isso é uma coisa importante. Quero também lembrar, e está aqui o nosso colega, professor Daniel Nascimento, da FRJ, lá no fundo, que parte dessas atividades dessa semana, 2 mesas redondas especialmente, estão ligadas a um projeto que a Archai, coordenado pelo Daniel, está desenvolvendo pelo CNPq, que é um projeto que nós chamamos de Politeia, e que, na verdade, tem como título a República de Platão e suas intertextualidades. Então, obrigado, Daniel, também para integrar um pouco esse trabalho conosco. Eu quero dar as boas-vindas especialmente aos meus alunos que vieram de Brasília, né? Aqui, os alunos da Archai, o pessoal que se... Alguns estão atrasados, devem ter atrasado o avião, né? Atrasou o avião? Estão no Uber, estão achando isso, está faltando alguém. E tantos amigos e colegas que estão aqui, Vissa, Rafael, o Michel, que veio lá de longe, né? Todo mundo aqui, não vou citar todo mundo, porque senão vou ficar aqui a manhã inteira, mas que legal revê-los. Eu concluo dizendo que eu tive um pequeno acidente, como vocês estão vendo, o que vai me obrigar a ter que, em algum momento, sair dessa semana e voltar para casa, mas eu estava esperando para esse momento de abertura e as aulas da professora Chloe com muita vontade, com muito desejo. Eu não quis sair antes de, pelo menos, darmos juntos esse, né, golpe inicial na bola dessa semana. Muito obrigado novamente pela acolhida. Eu quero passar a palavra para o professor Renato.
Bom, boa tarde a todos, boa tarde a todas. Eu queria iniciar dizendo que é um grande prazer estar aqui novamente. É realmente assim, muito interessante para nós do Departamento de Filosofia da PUC e, sobretudo, para nós do nosso núcleo de Filosofia Antiga da PUC, o Nufa, fazer parte dessa parceria que tem sido costurada pelo desembargador Gustavo, pelo nosso querido amigo Gabriele Cornelli, e com auxílio e suporte do desembargador Cláudio del Orto também, que também tem estado presente nesses momentos de encontro. O encontro que nós tivemos aqui da última vez foi muito interessante para todos nós. Eu recebi muitos comentários positivos dos alunos, das pessoas presentes. Eu acho realmente que essa parceria, tanto pessoal quanto uma parceria acadêmica entre filosofia, sobretudo filosofia antiga, e a área de magistratura, a área de estudo do direito e a classe dos juízes é muito interessante, muito benéfica para ambas as partes. Para a gente é realmente um prazer muito grande estar aqui. Agradeço mesmo em nome de todos os alunos de filosofia do Nufa e da PUC-Rio, e tenho certeza que também falo em nome de diversos colegas que estão aqui presentes, a oportunidade de participar desse encontro, que é um encontro tão frutífero. Eu não queria me alongar muito, mas após esses agradecimentos iniciais, eu teria um informe organizacional para fazer, que nós tínhamos previsto uma atividade na quarta-feira lá na PUC. E nós íamos fazer um debate sobre filosofia antiga e colonialismo. Acho que seria um debate muito interessante. E seria um momento em que nós ouviríamos um dos grandes responsáveis, se não o maior responsável por tudo isso acontecer, que é o professor Gabriele. Agora, com a partida adiantada do professor Gabriele por motivos de saúde ortopédica, é mais provável que esse encontro de quarta-feira no Nufa não aconteça, e que quarta-feira seja, portanto, um dia livre para quem fizer parte da Summer School. Então, era só um aviso que eu precisava dar para vocês. Bom, além disso, eu gostaria de agradecer enormemente a presença da professora Chloe, que vai nos brindar aí com um curso certamente muito interessante. Ela já esteve no Rio anteriormente, tentamos nos encontrar, não nos encontramos, e agora, então, terei o grande prazer de acompanhar não só uma palestra, mas todo um curso da professora Chloe. Bom, novamente, muito obrigado. Obrigado a todos. Eu não sei se passamos direto a palavra para a professora Chloe. Então, gostaria tenho a honra de pedir uma salva de palmas à professora Chloe Balla, que vai nos brindar com a palestra. On Human Nature and Greed.
I can't thank you enough. This is a marvelous event, and thank you very, very much for organizing it and for the wonderful hospitality. Judge Cláudio del Orto, Judge Gustavo Direito, whom I had the opportunity to meet in Athens, my good old friend, Professor Gabriele Cornelli, and I had to come back, as you just said, because I didn't meet you last time, so Professor Renato Matoso Brandao. So I'm also very happy to be here because because of the context and of the one fact that the historiography of philosophy sometimes misses, which is that much of what we think of as philosophy or how it is shaped goes back to a very important trial, which is the trial of Socrates. And it's very rare. I mean, it's unique for me to have the opportunity to make this statement here, and but also to present some of the research material I have been working on recently, which is becoming more and more attractive or visible also in the international scene. And I will start by making a reference to the recent speech of the Canadian Prime Minister McCartney, who invoked at the speech of Davos the Million Dialogue. So this is I think this is the first. Oh no, this is mine. I have to. I'm sorry. How do I do this? Yes. So I'm sure this is a text that you're all familiar with. It's the Million Dialogue, in which the Athenians tell basically the millions in Thucydides that it's very nice to talk and to develop the art of argumentation, but when the two parties are not equal, then this is completely immaterial and it has no meaning. There is much we could talk about in connection to Thucydides, even much more in connection to the international scene right now, but I will not pretend to be a political scientist, so we'll go to what I'm more familiar with, which is ancient philosophy, and I will try to challenge an idea that is very often it circulates in connection to the sophists, which is that here in the Million Dialogue, Thucydides is just reflecting something that the sophists taught. And I will try to show you in this week that this is something that goes basically back to Thucydides, this pessimistic vision or account, it's not a vision, an account of human nature that we are still, I hope, able to resist through an education in the humanities. And I'm very glad to see that this is a good context to think about such ideas. So I will start with an outline of my 4 presentations. And I will just refer very briefly to what I believe is a paradigm shift on the sophists. So the sophists have been in the past not studied so much or studied through the eyes of Plato. Guthrie's History of Philosophy has been extremely influential in the West, in the English-speaking universities. It was all through Plato and Plato's eyes. The sophists were the bad guys, were the ones that endorsed the kind of morality that the Athenian imperialists express in Thucydides' history. But it is relatively recent. So the first publication I mentioned actually is 2011, that this idea has changed. And I don't want to spend much time in talking about the particular papers. Maybe I can share this bibliography and you can, maybe the one example I want to focus on is the Loeb recent, again, relatively recent, it's 2016, so 10 years ago, André Lacks and Clem Most, in their Loeb series of early Greek philosophy, have a volume which is devoted on the sophists, and they include in this volume Socrates also, which is very interesting. And when we discussed this with the editors, they said that it was Loeb that insisted that they wanted to have the title sophist. And why am I saying this? Because more and more people agree today that this is something that philosophers like Plato use as a label to downgrade a profession or a tradition that was current, in Socrates' time, and people like Plato again thought it was very important to demarcate what they claimed to be their field, and also Socrates' field, and to suggest that the sophists were something different. So they had to define the sophists as something different. So I will say a few things today also before I turn to the question of greed, and before I explain to you why I think that this does not go back to the sophists. I mean, the idea that greed is part of an essential, fundamental part of human nature. I will start with a breakdown of the 4 lectures and try to explain how I think that they fit one another. So first one is on greed. As I already said, according to the standard view, the sophists endorse the pessimistic anthropology that permeates Thucydides' history, which shows that as soon as the constraints of social structure are removed, human beings reveal their real egoistic nature. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
Do you want to introduce
Yeah. No. Yeah, maybe because I, thank you. So I have an article in this journal, Polis, Pefik and Pleonectine, which means by nature we are greedy. And my question mark, is this the case? Plato and the Sophists on greed and savage humanity. And there I explain in more detail why I think the Sophist association with this idea, the one that Thucydides attributes to the Athenian imperialists, so the association of the Sophists with this idea, rests on a misunderstanding that has shaped our philosophical historiography on the Sophists. Today, I will describe the more general framework, focusing on Plato's construal of the categories of the philosopher and of the Sophists, which lies behind the misunderstanding, which is the association of the Sophists with a pessimistic anthropology. And I will draw attention to the much more optimistic humanistic anthropology that permeates Protagoras' great speech, a text that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, in Plato's dialogue Protagoras. So next, I'll remember it. So the breakdown of my 4 lectures, this is the second lecture. Tomorrow then, I will turn to some well-known texts from Plato that are often seen as crystallizing or reflecting the argument concerning greed and savage nature that originates with the Sophists. And I will argue that contrary to the standard interpretation, that conception emerges as a challenge or a paradox, but also as an offshoot of Socratic apologetics. Because as I said in the beginning, Socrates' trial triggers the discipline that we now know as philosophy, despite the fact that when we read Aristotle's Metaphysics, for those of you who are familiar with this text, and in classes of philosophy, we always say that it all starts with cosmology. But when people like Plato, who is the first one to claim a domain for philosophy, decide to do that, it's to show that Socrates was innocent and that he had nothing to do with the Sophists. And in order to do that, they have to maybe explain why the education that is associated with the Sophists is a completely different and much more concrete thing than we realize it is when we look at the texts of the Sophists. Of course, a very important source here is Aristophanes' Clouds, in which Socrates is presented as a lawyer and a philosopher. We'll come back to that tomorrow. So my third lecture, thank you, Renato, is on Thursday, when I will turn from Republic 2, which I will discuss tomorrow, because I said I will talk about some emblematic Platonic texts tomorrow, and this will be Gyges' Ring, book 2 of the Republic, the beginning, what we call Glaucon's Challenge, and Callicles' speech in the Gorgias. So I will talk about those 2 texts tomorrow. And then on Thursday, I will turn to Republic 1, and I will situate the argument of Thrasymachus, with which the Republic starts. And Thrasymachus is widely considered as a proponent of political realism. I will show how his interest in the variety of constitutions, which is a practical interest among the sophists, explains also or supports Plato's decision to put him in the beginning of the Republic and to make him look like this monster, basically. I don't care if he was a monster or not. I just want to show how different the texts, the conclusions we draw from the texts are once we look at them more carefully. And what's intriguing, I hope, in my third lecture, is that we have this later testimony by the peripatetic Aristoxenus, who says that Plato plagiarized Protagoras. So I will try to show how people like Aristoxenus could look at the Republic in this way and see the Republic's interest in the different constitutions, or in the contrast between the best and the worst constitutions, as something that is using Protagoras, and I will fit Thrasymachus in my story. And the fourth one, the title of my fourth contribution is borrowed from Tony Long's book, Greek Models of the Mind and the Self, The Perils of Persuasion. And this is a great book, actually, and Long draws attention to the depth of early philosophical ideas on the soul-body distinction, on dualism. And the protagonists in that story are Socrates, Gorgias, and also Plato, who in the laws brings together the power of rhetoric with legislation. And we have here people who are expert in the laws, so I think we can have an interesting discussion. On Friday, I will explain how Plato, toward the end of his career, is transformed from an enemy to a supporter of rhetoric. And I will connect this transformation with Plato's, but also Socrates' interest in the soul, the psyche, and we'll compare that with Gorgias' psychology of speech, the psychology of logos, in his Helen. And I'm really sorry that I will miss Gabriele, who has worked on the Phaedo, and maybe we could discuss the importance of dualism in this context. So next. Okay, back to episode 1. Plato's construction of the category of the sophists. The sophists, as I said already, are a foil to Plato's construal of philosophy. You may already be familiar with the famous definition of philosophy in the Theaetetus, which is that philosophers are trying to become like gods. It is useful to contrast now, looking ahead, this discussion, to take into account the contrast that also takes, is present in Aristotle's construal of theoria and the vita contemplativa, in Metaphysics Alpha again. So we have this idea of the philosopher being, having the luxury of leisure, of scholae, which is opposed to the practice of popular government, the judges of the courts in Athens who didn't have the time to judge, but not that the judges today have the time to judge, and it is impossible to have too much time. And that's sometimes a problem with philosophers, that they cannot be practical enough because they think they can just go on and on, talk forever. And by the way, I have time until 5. Having said that, hopefully there will be time for discussion. I'm very interested to have that also. So it's one point of contrast is the claim that Plato makes, scholazein, the word from which we have school, because to have schools you need leisure, and this is something that our civilization has fought for, and I hope we can keep it. This Plato contrasts to the practice of popular government, the distribution of justice, which happened in Athenian courts as a matter of practice, and it was something almost trivial without people ever considering what justice really means. And on the one hand, of course, it's very important and very interesting and even moving that the judges here
give us the space and the time to talk about those things. On the other hand, those of you who are professionals know that it's easy to judge without having read the Republic, and it's okay. I mean, what's more important is to be honest people, without necessarily having an answer to the question, what does honesty mean? The other point of contrast that Plato capitalizes on is experience as opposed to theoria, mere practice that rests on the observance of human behavior, which is downgraded in Plato's Gorgias, and where rhetoric is presented as a mere knack or tribé, and is identified with flattery. So the sophists will just manipulate the audience, just noticing what parts of their emotional attitudes they can trigger. So they study this in a semi-behaviorist way. And then Plato comes along and he says, no, what you have to take into consideration is, of course, the structure of the soul and the fact that it's the highest part, the rational part, that leads the other two. So again, Plato makes us think that the sophists were too naive and they hadn't realized that the agent in us is the rational part. I don't want to say that Plato is out of his mind, because definitely we have no evidence that suggests that any of the sophists developed the kind of more sophisticated psychology that Plato, using the leisure and being outside the polis, presents in his Republic. But whether Athenian rhetoric was only about flattery, I think it's something we would like to resist. Also because of the fact that it is a shame to think of Athenian democracy as something that at the end is reduced to the imperialism that Thucydides is criticizing. I mean, it's very good to bear in mind that we need to be more humble, but it's also very important to realize that the democracy that Plato is criticizing or even fighting against was the closest our history of civilization could see as real democracy. And it's often said, and it is the case, that we don't have any text which supports democracy from inside. I mean, we have the myth, the great speech of Prometheus, of Protagoras, which I will talk about at the end of my contribution today. And we have the constitution of the Athenians, because Aristotle reports on all the existing constitutions. But I guess the Athenian democracy was just about running the state and not about reflecting on what the fundamental theory behind that was, which is okay, is what I want to say. And here some pictures, Thales falling into a well. Those of you who have read the Theaetetus remember that when Plato talks about philosophy as becoming like God, he gives this anecdote, which is interesting because Plato does that. I mean, it's like giving us a hint at the fact that you can't go very far with that either, of Thales looking at the stars and falling into a well. And this is what theory can give you or get you. And on the other hand, yes? On the other hand, we have democracy in practice, what people do, and the last, the picture on the right is the water clock that Plato in the Theaetetus refers to as the reason why, as a case that shows how an orator, so like Protagoras presumably, or someone who educates people in this kind of skills, will always have to time their speech and will never have the opportunity to reflect on what they are saying and going back, which is a very interesting, actually, contrast of the Theaetetus. And it's, again, since I said how honored I am to give this talk at this kind of setting, the Theaetetus, which is the first important text of epistemology, the theory of knowledge, is situated in a context that is related to the courts, but also to being able to have the time to talk forever and to go back and correct your manuscript. It's there in the very beginning of the text. But let me go back to my story. So, the water clock, those of you who have been to Athens, these are all in the Agora Museum. The picture in the middle is the site of the Pnyx across from the Acropolis, from the Parthenon. People gathered in courts and very regularly. All the information is, or much of this information, is derived from Aristotle's Constitution of the Athenians or from the orator's speeches. And this is the randomizing machine, which I don't think we have any textual evidence on this. We have no idea who came up with this idea, but it is a marvelous idea. I don't know if you're familiar with this. People would put slide their names in the little tags you see on the left, and so they would present themselves at the courts to exercise their duty of judging, of running the democracy. And who was going to man the court, it was only men, was judged, decided by the little thing in the left was a little ball that, depending on what came, one name was excluded and the other one was included. And at the right, you see the dikast ballots, which allowed people to vote without others knowing what they voted on. So there was a very interesting and very sophisticated technology that went with democracy. And this is what is completely downgraded when we look at from Plato's point of view. Before I proceed, I would like to mention a different kind of contrast, which I will find important for our discussion, which has to do with Plato's Socratic apologetics. So Plato presents many of the so-called sophists as logographers, as people who wrote their speeches or speeches that could be imitated, people could practice on those speeches, we call those epideictic speeches. And on the one hand, you have this kind of education. On the other hand, you have the idea of Socratic, the educational model of Socratic midwifery in the Theaetetus, so a dialogue with someone who will present their ideas, not their truth, but Socrates is trying to show, to help the people realize what they believe and how important this is, and to help them get rid of wrong beliefs. And the entire Phaedrus, of course, is again a contrast between an education that focuses on writing. It starts with Lysias, who is an orator, and he gives a speech on love, but this is a ready-made speech. I mean, it's kind of ironical that this is the art that allows you to talk about love without even knowing who this is addressed to. I mean, it's not an accident that this is the topic that is being chosen. And in this dialogue, the Phaedrus, Socrates invokes the psyche, the soul, the importance of psychology, and how a proper kind of rhetoric will have to take into account who is your addressee. And at the end of my talks this week, we will see how this idea of taking into account who is your addressee is relevant to Plato's laws, to the preambles to the laws, where Plato envisages an ideal legislator who will be able to persuade their audience by, how can this happen, of course, to talk or to see who's across and persuade them of what is the content of the law. And I said that it is important to take into account the Socratic heritage in this respect, because we will see on Friday this passage from Socrates, from Aristophanes' Birds. I don't know if you're familiar with this, where Socrates is presented as a filthy guy by a lake conjuring the souls. So kind of a seer, something more bizarre and not so philosophical from our perspective. But this has to do, I suppose, with this tendency, which was almost new in the 5th century. It comes from the Pythagoreans, maybe, that the real self is the soul, and that just invading someone's country is not going to give you anything, because it would only give you something to your body, to go back to the Milian dialogue. So that's another point of contrast that Plato, I think, is invoking when he contrasts what he brings, what he proposes as philosophy, going back to Socrates also, from what the Sophists do. I would like to say a few things about, I could say a few things about who are the Sophists and what they are. This is not easy, because the first thing I would say is that we think of them as a group, but they're probably not a group. What makes them look like a group is that they are attracted to Athens. Some people like Jacqueline de Romilly have argued that they are attracted to Athens because Athens is a democracy. There is a very interesting paper by Eric Robinson, The Sophists and Democracy Beyond Athens, which suggests that, of course, these people already had those skills. I mean, what would they be teaching? How could they know those things? There is this evidence from Cicero, which says that rhetoric starts from Sicily because of courts, but in which case it would only be from people from Sicily. Protagoras comes from Abdera, and there are so many other people from other city-states. And the problem, of course, methodologically, is that we don't have the evidence we need to reconstruct what those states were. But people are more and more turning into epigraphic evidence, or even the monuments that would allow people to gather. And apparently democracy, popular government, because democracy, as we will discuss on Thursday, is a term of abuse when it arises, when it starts being used. It's like populism, maybe. So something that people who were skeptical toward the democracy would use. So popular government is something that is practiced outside Athens, and the people who come to Athens already know how to argue. That's another misconception. We probably shouldn't think that all that sophists taught was argumentation. Again, it is Plato who suggests that it is all about form and about efficacy, and without any interest in the content, how they will flatter people, how they don't care about what is the case. It is philosophers who will go outside the cave and see the sun, and to do that you have to study mathematics and spend the whole life in that. So the sophists basically do something much more shallow and superficial. But as I said, to say that, we need to have the evidence that I think is missing, and I will come back to that. So, are they attracted to Athens because Athens is a democracy, or do they come to Athens because they already have this background? And do they teach do they only persuade, or do they do other things also? And here I want to refer to a very interesting contribution by Mauro Bonazzi in an article called Political, All Too Political, again on Protagoras' myth in its intellectual context, I'm sorry. And if we can, yes. Okay, so what Bonazzi says is that, I'm sure you're familiar with the fascination of 5th century authors with technai, with the power that humans have to craft things and to reason about everything, and also sometimes people like in the Antigone reflect on what will stop their ability to use this for any purpose, which is again something that we worry about these days with technology a lot. So what Bonazzi says is that Protagoras is the only one, or the first one, to insist on the fact that technai alone are not able to ensure human progress or human survival, for the problem is not external, so to say, but internal. And quoting from the great speech in the Protagoras, people had the technai, but they committed injustice against one another. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the myth. I will just remind you that it starts with Epimetheus, who gives the faculties, the dynames, to all the animals, and so the animals have what they need for their survival, and humans are left without any of the powers that animals have. So what are you going to do with that? The gods give them the technai at first, but then they still cannot live with one another because they commit injustice. And technical skills can help with natural necessities, but are not useful with human relations, which constitute a far more complicated problem. Indeed, human relations, in other words, politics, are a much more complex and potentially dangerous issue than our natural weakness. Conflict, which was prominently absent in the other text, becomes the real problem for Protagoras, who is also in a position to offer a solution to it through his teaching. So, of course, since my presentation today is on greed, you may argue that what the Protagoras text is telling us is that people are naturally greedy, and then, or that they would commit injustice by nature, and that it's that the political skill is imposed on them. And this is an interpretation that sometimes we find, but we can also resist that, because the myth, part of the myth is to tell us what is natural for each organism, and just as for Some animals, it is natural to attack others because they are bigger, or to run very much, very fast. For human, what it is to me to be human is to be able to live in a community. And what, I will come back to that, but speaking about the technai, what is interesting with Protagoras and with Plato's Protagoras is that he claims to teach something that, maybe we can go to the next one, that the others don't teach. And the beginning of Plato's Protagoras has this very interesting description of all the canonical sophists who are in Callias's house, and what each one does. It's a very interesting image. And Protagoras says that the other people harm young men, driving them back despite resistance towards the arts that they have fled. So you have these young people who can afford, presumably, an education with the sophists, because this was not a given. I mean, we talk about democracy, but it was people who could afford. What makes a difference, of course, it is that it didn't have much to do with your family, because you can now go to the sophists and acquire some skills or some training that you would not get otherwise. And that's the emblematic text in this regard is Aristophanes' Cláudio, the son who is taken by the father to the lawyer Socrates, or someone who can teach them how to make escape the credits, but also to change the stronger argument into the weaker. So you don't care about your family so much, it's the teachers, and it's people like Socrates and other sophists who can train you. But what will they train you in? So even in the clouds, it's these tricks that the father wants to introduce his son to when he takes him to Socrates, and this is very interesting that this is Socrates. It's something about cosmology, so the limits between sophists and philosophers are kind of blurred, and that fits with what I said before, that when Plato steps in, he says, well, let's divide now what is our domain in philosophy and what the rest are doing. And that's how the first account of what philosophy is about starts. But we see, on the one hand, in Protagoras, in Plato's Protagoras, but also in the titles of the texts that have reached us about the sophists, because we only have mostly fragments, that the people we think of as sophists would not focus only on argumentation of the techneton logon. In fact, it is Socrates, if you read Xenophon's Memorabilia, Xenophon suggests that Socrates was seen as someone who was teaching logoi, so arguments, language, something that people could afford to spend time on. It's only what I want to say when Plato steps in that he says that this is very practically oriented, this is oriented to lying. Well, of course, you already have Aristophanes who suggests that, but the big difference is that Aristophanes is writing satire, right? It's very different. But if you go to Aristophanes, why the jump of the flea is relevant to the studies of sophists, right? And Protagoras says, all these guys just give you the normal techne. What I'm going to teach is euboulia, good judgment, and this is very important. And this is something that all humans have the ability, they are susceptible to learning this, and this is part of the teaching of the myth. So I'm reading from Protagoras. For the other people harmed young men, driving them back despite resistance towards the arts that they have fled, they cast them upon those arts, teaching arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music. And he casts a glance at Hippias. So it is Protagoras who does something new. One parenthesis and one aporia you might have looking at the breakdown of my lectures. Protagoras, we know from a different dialogue, the Theaetetus, that is the father of relativism. And at first I thought I would give a talk on homo mensura, which is that man, human, is the measure of all things. On the other hand, more and more scholars today agree that this should not be thought of as something that had anything or much to do with Protagoras, but more something that Plato describes, construes as relativism, and he attributes it to Protagoras, who now becomes the enemy, someone who was only dealing with the domain of practical politics, and could put up with the idea that human beings had different points of view, and that's okay, to the point that there is no objective truth. And this is what we have, what people, especially in the history of philosophy, typically associate with Protagoras. But one question that one can raise is why the Protagoras of the Theaetetus is so different from the Protagoras who teaches good judgment. So if it is good judgment, one could say, of course, it's good judgment, meaning that you can buy, you can persuade people, whether it's true or not, it doesn't really matter. But that's not what we get in Protagoras, and it's not what we get in the great myth. As I said, I will make a break in a few minutes to see if there are questions, and then I will move to the great myth, to the great speech of Protagoras. One question I want to raise and one idea I want to resist is, going back to the Milian dialogue of Thucydides, the idea that this premise that human beings are pleonectic. This is used pleonexia, which means the word means to have more. Greed, we translate it as greed. That this is an idea shared by many or all of the sophists. And one of the texts that is interesting to look at, and in my original plan, I thought I would do one talk on the gods, and then I thought maybe this is not an audience that would be very interested in that. But one very interesting idea that emerges among the sophists is that of atheism, and it's atheism in the sense of not believing in the gods that the society, that the polis accepts, which is also very interesting. I mean, it's more about social cohesion than about dogma. And one text that we have that is very interesting, and some people attribute to Critias and some people attribute to Euripides, is this Sisyphus fragment, which describes how the idea of God first arose. And the reason why I want to read this text is to ask you if you think that this is evidence for the idea that human nature is originally savage and that greed comes, what it means that to be human, in which case nomoi, the laws, are constraints on our human nature, which could, I mean, ideally we would like to have Gyges' ring and just follow our appetites. So the text is the following, and what I want to discuss is whether it is evidence to suggest that we have this idea of an original savage nature. There was a time when human life was disordered and bestial and subservient to might. when there was neither reward for good men, nor, on the other hand, punishment for bad. And then, I think, men established laws which were punitive so that justice might be sovereign and keep aggression in servitude. And if any man did wrong, he was punished. Then, when the laws were preventing men from doing violence openly, but they did it in secret, that was the moment, I think, when, a word missing, some shrewdly intelligent and clever man, Sophos and Pyknos, invented for mankind fear of gods, so that there might be something to frighten bad men, even if they do or say or think something in secret. From that time, therefore, he introduced belief in gods, that there exists a divine power flourishing with indestructible life, and hearing and seeing with the mind, and both thinking and attending to these things, and bearing a godlike nature, which will hear everything that has been said among men, Scaria, and will be able to see everything that is being done. Familiar idea, however. Further, if you silently plan some evil, this will not escape the gods' notice, for there is intelligent awareness in them. In saying these words, he introduced the most pleasant of teachings, hiding the truth with words of falsity. He asserted that the gods lived in a place that would especially terrify men when he made them aware of it. So the question I want to, so the argument here is that the reason why people are refrain from doing injustice is either that they will be watched, policed, or that they are afraid of what happened in the afterlife, I guess, or that the God will watch them, and so on and so forth. And this text is sometimes used as evidence for the idea that the sophists, quite generally, endorse the premise that human nature is savage. But do we have this? And I think I could stop for a while and see what you think about many of the things I have said before I move on a little bit with Protagoras myth. Is this grounds for this idea?
May I just ask you to explain a bit more what do you mean by savage in this context? So it's like primitive. A primitive,
yes, a primitive, something that humans by nature are pleonectic, greedy.
No society, yes, no control.
Yes.
Yeah.
Before society steps in and gives us the constraints, we all would tend to seek our appetites, Plato would say, and that this is natural. Is this part of this story?
Very English.
Huh?
It's very English.
What is very English?
This idea of,
The idea is very English, but is this in the text? And I'm sorry for it's a very small script, and maybe I can just ask you to send it to people. So what it says, it doesn't say, well, before I say what I think, are there other views? So is the idea that human nature is greedy part of this story? What did you mean by very English, Gabriele? Is this live streamed?
No, because this idea of starting from a pessimistic view of the human
English
being,
as in the history of philosophy, yes.
You need the state to, Hobbes says,
that in that sense, English.
Yes,
okay, yes, Anglo-Saxon. Exactly, and this is very interesting because Guthrie, who gave us the canon, the way to look at the sophists, had this kind of education. and this kind of background. Thank you. So it's easy to read this into this text, but what I want to say is that this is not in the text. All the text says is that some people are bad, some people are good. It doesn't say anything about human nature. Huh? It says something about wisdom of someone who can even invent the gods, huh? And that's typical of the, I guess, of the idea of wisdom that could be very inventing things without what Plato would find scary. But that's a different story. And some people also who think that this is Critias say, that makes sense because Critias is the head of the 30 tyrants. But, I mean, in the past, I have argued that tyrants do not advertise their ideas. But these days, I'm afraid I can't say that. I think that tyrants can even say whatever they want. You know, I want this island, I will go and get it. So things are changing, and it's interesting. But I don't think that someone like Critias from the Socratic circle would advertise this thing. And if nothing, this is also part of a satire play. So it's a character who says that. And one thing that I believe is that what is sophistic in the sense of it being current in sophistic education is the challenge. What happens? What if people did not obey the laws? Or what if they only obey them because they are written and they are afraid of the punishment? The fact that we have in fragments this kind of argument, as I will show you in a few minutes, does not suggest that people endorsed this kind of morality. And I'm glad you raised this point about it being English, because for modern readers, it's very easy to look at this way. And if you look at this way, what you do is that you find Thucydides' pessimistic view and his anxiety about human nature, instead of it being something that we should resist, as something that is part of what human beings are. And this is what makes Protagoras so unique and so optimistic, on the other hand, despite the fact that some people can think that it is the gods who impose these skills to us, and they make us political, craft us like this. I mean, the way I understand it is that that's how we are, and we want society. Why? Of course, when you compare us with animals, they have their own mechanisms, and these are built into their nature. In our nature, what we have and what we had to develop to be in societies was the sense of right and wrong. And I think this is very Protagorean, very humanistic, and very optimistic at the same time. So apart from Prometheus' great speech, at this point, Zeus became worried that our species might perish altogether from the earth, so he asked Hermes to take down to people a sense of right and wrong. The words here are eidos and dike. Respect or shame sometimes, eidos, and right. This was to bring order to societies and to serve as the bonds for friendship and love and bring us together. So Hermes said to Zeus, but how? How am I supposed to give this sense of right and wrong? Should I hand it out in the same way we handed out the technical skills? Of course, the technical skills become a point of comparison because it's the expertise that only some people have. And what has triggered Protagoras' myth is Socrates' own aporia. Why is it that the Athenians go to an engineer when they want to build a wall, and when they have to take a very important decision about the city's policy, they just make everyone, and isn't this an expertise also to be, to do politiké, to do politics? And Protagoras says, no, everybody has that. You remember how they were handed out, the skills. One person with, say, knowledge of medicine is enough for a large number of people who don't know anything about it. And it is the same with the other skilled professions. So shall I put a sense of right and wrong in humankind like that, or should I hand it out to all of them? In the former case, you would be anticipating Plato's idea of expert technocrats who run the city. It's interesting that Plato doesn't say that here. I mean that I think that Plato is much smarter than that. And he makes Protagoras show what he's doing. Give it out to all of them, said Zeus. Every single man must have a share. The fact is, there is no way societies could exist at all if only a few people possessed a sense of right and wrong, the way it is with those other skills. In fact, make it a rule in my authority that anyone who proves incapable of acquiring some sense of right and wrong must be thought of as a sickness to society and put to death. So we have to stick together. That's part of our nature. And the thinker who was going to explicitly state this as a definition of what a human being is, and I'm saying a thinker because I want to challenge the distinction between philosopher and sophist, is of course Aristotle, who says that human beings are by nature political animals. I think it is already anticipated in Protagoras. One question one can raise. You're going to raise this question, thank you. I asked her before, yes. Please, yeah.
No, I was thinking about love.
Love.
Love precedes all of that wrong and right. Love.
Love.
Love is more
More original. Love, which can be friendship in love. Yes.
emotions.
Yes.
Reason, love. Or you think love would be something.
Irle, desculpe. Usa o microfone, por favor.
Okay. It's a very good question, and I'm sure that there are people here who have ideas about that. One can think also of Aristophanes' myth in the Symposium, right? How we all need a second half. Yes, that's not very political. I mean, it's very human.
It's not political.
Yes.
I'm not thinking political.
I'm not judging you. I'm just saying why Protagoras would not raise that. Yes.
Man is
Savage. Yeah.
nature
Yeah.
is fundamentally naturally free, or
Yeah. It's a very good question. I have an answer, but I want to hear. You need the microphone also. I think because this is being recorded.
I just would like to remember that in the first book of the Politics, Aristotle says that
Family.
Philia is the very beginning of a polis.
Yes, and the bond of the family also, I guess, is what gradually takes you to the polis. But if it was just love, I mean, other thoughts about it. Well, the first thing I think is that if it was just love, that would not explain the society, a bigger polis. We're not friends with everyone, but we try, and this is what a sophist can do, to bring together opposite parties, opposite views. We don't need to be friends, all of us. Civic friendship is a very important thing, but it is civic friendship, right? It's not love. And I think it's interesting, that's another reason I like your question, that Plato problematizes love as something that is not political. It's something that allows you to be in a club, in a more secret society. But then what happens to the polis? I mean, is it just your friends or your club, or are you going to find a way to deliberate with everyone at the assembly? And this is very, very important. And you know that from, I mean, those of us who are professional, everywhere. You need to coexist with people. It's part of your role. I mean, some of us may just want to be with their partner and not care about, but some of us want to change and to be part of the society and to make sure that there will be no Athenians, and I live in Athens, who will say that, forget about arguments, we have the force. So that's what it means to be human, I guess.
I remember in Republic, Plato constructs the polis as it has to be philia between everybody.
Yes.
If you don't have philia, you don't have, you'll never have a just polis. He says that.
Yeah, he says that.
In the Republic.
He does, but there is a reason why we describe the Republic as a utopia. Yes, this is sorry? Yes, but all these are, and it's interesting that it helps my effort to define what a sophist is. A sophist is something that is looking to what you have, I guess, and you have democracy which is being practiced. You cannot make everyone friends with one another. You don't even know these people. And that's where Socrates comes as a different voice. And he talks about the psyche, the soul. From the beginning of the Protagoras, he says, but what about your soul? What you're going to give to this man, your soul? And of course, you cannot have politics based on dialogue and psychoanalysis, because you have to decide, right? Here, you have to make decisions and to move on. Otherwise, I don't know how fast the system of justice goes here. In Greece, it is pathetic. If we just had to analyze the soul of everyone and to become, say, friends, then, and that's why Plato has a point when he contrasts the life of the philosopher, who ends up falling in the well, from the life of the orator, who's like a slave of the water clock. But please.
I guess philia gives origin to respect. Respecting each other is having philia in the Republic. Respecting what everybody does, what anyone can do. This is how philia is understood in Republic.
In the Republic, yes, true. And that's why Aristotle has different kinds of philia also, possibly because he reflects on this. And it's a great vision, I guess, but still I don't know how pragmatic this is when you deal with a huge audience of people that you don't know, and that's what happens in a polis.
Utility.
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 Yes.
I think the Greeks, ancient Greek, I'm sorry because I'm not Greek.
It's.
But I think
I would have said nobody's perfect if I believed that being Greek is a privilege, but I don't think so.
Okay. The ancient Greeks, well, I know this by scholars, commentaries. They are interested in utility. Mm-hmm. This is very important if you are or not useful for each other. And this involves philia. And philia, as I was taught, also means love.
It does. That's what I said
Also
in the
means-
beginning. Yes, you can. There is a single. It is love translates both philia and eros
Agape.
in Greek.
Also
Agape is a later term. It comes with
No,
also
because
with the
we
Christians.
have vase, the barro. Como é que fala o barro de barro?
Yeah, basis.
Vase. With persons loving each other, designs, and written agape. This is in a book called Greek Homosexuality.
Yes, yes.
Of that English, the famous English.
Dover.
Dover,
Yes,
K. Dover,
yes, yes,
KJ
yes,
Dover.
Yes. Yes, the term is there, but
So
then,
the term
yes, the
agape
term is there. Yes, the term
Seems
is there.
it means love
Yeah,
and
yeah.
sexual love as well. The Christians took agape
Yeah, yeah.
but there.
I think it's more generic in Greek, but the agape and that the distinction in Christianity is very interesting. Anyway, to go back to trying to make sense of Protagoras and what he gives us, but possibly also of what he lacks. Well, this is a good point. He says nothing about philia and civic friendship, and maybe that is room for philosophers to step in and to introduce a new vision. Also, when they connect philia to justice, very important question. I don't think the sophists raise this question. So these are all very interesting as discussions that start maybe from the sophists, or that the sophists leave outside. And now I want to, was there another, no. Okay. I want to turn to a paper that I find very interesting by Adam Beresford, which is called Fangs, Feathers, and Fairness, Protagoras on the Origins of Right and Wrong. And we will have the opportunity to come back to this aspect of the myth, but let me remind you very briefly that the detail with which Protagoras describes each individual animal and what powers they have with them is very central, very fundamental in his account. And this is like something that occurs from necessity. What lacks, again, from Protagoras' story, which is very interesting, is any notion of providence. So even the gods, when they step in the picture, they come to remedy something which would prevent the human race of being destroyed. You want to give an account that explains how all the species are there. And Epimetheus didn't do a very good job, because Epimetheus is someone who has no forethought, so no providence, so he stresses this. And this may have something to do with Protagoras' background, or that he comes from the same tradition as Democritus, people who did not care about the gods. I said before that I'm not going to talk about homo mensura, but one thing that is very important about the idea of man is the measure of all things is that you don't think that this comes from the gods. You just believe in human reason. And again, there is a reason why we talk about more ancient Greek enlightenment, that people trust their reason. And this is very, very important. And that's what I think Protagoras meant when he said that I don't know anything about the gods, and all we have is human minds who will think and discuss. Sometimes it gets very close to what Plato says, and we will. And again, I think there is a reason why Aristophanes says that Plato plagiarized Protagoras. So let me go back to this very nice account that Beresford gives, seeing the Protagoras' account of human beings as a study of what it means to be human. Our technical ingenuity is given to us in the story by Prometheus, and his gifts enable us to survive. That is to say that our own intelligence and foresight, our ability to think ahead, allows us to survive in the way we do and occupy our ecological niche, that niche of the versatile, inventive, tool-making animal. This is once again strikingly close to Darwinian thinking in that it casts intelligence itself as just another biological endowment, similar to the endowments of other animals and dispensed under exactly the same natural rules. Two important philosophical ideas are implied by this view of things. First, Protagoras is saying that there is nothing special about humanity in the larger order. Now contrast Plato's statement that humans are endowed with some divine power and our mission here is to become like gods. We are here in order to think. If you've read the Timaeus, the cosmos has been created so that we have something to exercise our rational capacities, right? So everything very anthropocentric also. We are not the centerpiece of the cosmos, but just another animal muddling along with the rest of them. They have their ways of surviving and we have ours. What is interesting is that you don't have this kind of account until later in Lucretius, in Epicurus, because Democritus, who came also from Abdera and who was a contemporary of Protagoras, left very little writings behind. We have his account through Epicurus and Lucretius. So again, when I said that you're going to ask the question, I was going to raise what I thought was, of course, not what about love, but what about the authorship of the myth? And this is not a question we are able to answer, but from what we understand from Plato, it is very unlikely that even if it is fabricated by Plato, it would have nothing to do with Protagoras. I think for sure it would be commenting on ideas that were original in Protagoras. And this idea of proto-Darwinianism, along with the idea of there is no providence, these things happen because we have to give an account of how all the species are in place. And there is the same, Herodotus is also a contemporary of Protagoras, and we have an amazing passage in Herodotus that talks about providence. Again, it raises the question of how is it very ecological that all animal species remain the same in number? And we don't have too many mice. We have cats that eat them. And it's all a matter of providence. It's the same question that is raised, but Herodotus, who's not a philosopher, invokes providence. Protagoras says that's how things are, by necessity. And humans think in order to live. In Plato, people live in order to think, right? A very interesting contrast. So second, again, I'm reading from Beresford, the story implies that our intelligence is something that we have because it is a mechanism of survival. We think in order to live. This reverses the Platonic and Aristotelian view that ultimately human beings live in order to think. And you are familiar with this what I started from, this vision of theoria, of just trying to understand the hardest, most abstract ideas, and this is then contrasted to the much more shallow and superficial way in which justice is being distributed by people who haven't read the Republic. How can that happen? And that's why I gave you those, the image of the randomizing machine to suggest that these people were thinking about important things like good lawyers can think about without being experts in philosophy of law. You talked about the metaphysics of law, and this is very welcome, of course, but it sometimes blurs the fact that practice is something important and people can be honest without knowing what honesty means. So, for Plato and Aristotle, the workings of the mind, human or divine as the case may be, are primary and fundamental in the structure of the cosmos. And now I want to stop to see if you have thoughts about that, and then I want to add something. So now I will add this something. There is a lot of interesting scholarship about Protagoras and what we can reconstruct and what we can make from Plato's representation, and a lot of skepticism about the idea that Protagoras is the father of relativism. And if we can move on the last one, thank you. And there is this text that some people think it's from the Anonymous of Iamblikos that goes back to Protagoras, and which relates very obviously to our discussion of greed. But what it says is, one must not be greedy to have more. If someone were born possessing from the beginning such a nature as to be invulnerable in his flesh, immune to illness and suffering, extraordinarily large and indestructible in body and soul, a thought experiment, one might perhaps think that for someone like that, power founded upon greed might be sufficient. For a man like that could live in impunity without submitting to the law. And yet, to think like this is incorrect. For even if someone like this, such as could never come about, actually existed, it would only be by allying himself with the laws and justice and fortifying these, using his strength for the benefit of them and of what comes to the aid, that someone like this would preserve himself. I don't know if it's true, but what's important is that this is the vision and the lesson we get from this tradition. Otherwise, he could not survive. For all men would decide to make themselves the enemies of the man who had this nature, your friendship there, because of their respect for their laws, and their multitude, either by skill or by strength, would surpass such a man and would prevail over him. There is a lot of reason to think that this is Protagoras. I will argue tomorrow that this kind of intellectual experiment, like you have someone like Callicles, someone who's very strong, and he says, why do I care about the laws? Someone who could be behind the Athenians in the Melian dialogue. I don't see any evidence that anyone teaches this as morality. What you rather find in Plato, and to anticipate to my point of tomorrow, is an opportunity to show that Socrates had an answer to this kind of aggressive standpoint. And why did Plato care about that? One answer is that, of course, his trial had to do with his own association with people who were involved in the coup with the 30 tyrants. So people could think that that he didn't care, that he didn't have something that philosophy, which is what Plato represents, Socrates represents, and you see this in the Gorgias, because Callicles' speech in the Gorgias does not have an answer to this. Plato wants to say, no, you have people like Callicles. How do they come about? They come about because they are fascinated by sophists and orators like Gorgias. And what you really need to, as a prophylactic against this tendency, which is there because the sophists don't care to talk about the content of morality, is the kind of direction that philosophy gives you. And it's true, I think, that none of the sophists care too much about the content. What is not true, I think, is that they, just because they wanted to make money, they would make you give any argument you wanted. I know some lawyers that would do that, not very many. Of course, the fact that they got paid doesn't mean anything about the content of their ideas. One interesting, and I didn't know how we would do with time, that's why but maybe we can go back to the slide that was number 3 maybe, about where it's the paradigm shift as I described it. Further up. Further up. No, paradigm shift. The number 2, yes. So, yes, people like Bob Wallace in his Reconstructing Damon, but also in an article he has in the Cambridge Companion to Athenian Democracy, very nicely describes how the sophists were treated as educators. I mean, if they charged a lot of money, but people gave that money. I mean, nobody forced them to do that. And, you know, you go to a concert and you hear someone and you pay, I don't know how many dollars, and that's okay, right? It's very honorable also to do that. So I guess the sophists did something that nobody else did. And that was okay. It's wrong to think that philosophers had the awe that they have when we look at them from the point of view of Plato, because, and there is this very, I envy it, a very successful title, Calling Philosophers' Names by Christopher Moore, Princeton University Press, 2021. Nobody respected philosophers either. I mean, it's only when Plato comes and he makes things look different. But think of the Republic also. The idea of making the philosophers rulers is presented as a tsunami, something that nobody would buy because they are useless. Aristotle takes pride on that, right? That we are useless. We used to get away with that, but the way funding goes with universities now, we have to prove that we are not useless and go back to the sophists maybe. So, yes, to go back to Bob Wallace's argument, which I have found very helpful, is that things change once Athens starts to lose the war. After Pericles' death, after the plague, people start worrying about everything, and they worry about intellectuals. The intelligentsia becomes responsible for everything, and Socrates is one such case, right? People like Anytus, who is one of Socrates' accusers, refused to send his son to study. This starts being thought of as a problem. And I guess even when Thucydides makes Pericles use philosophumen in a pre-technical sense, we philosophize, we love wisdom. So we let the sophists maybe. But we do that without softness. He wants to suggest that the Athenians like this idle talk that Plato makes associates Socrates with, but that still gives them the opportunity to be part of politics. But I guess that's Pericles' speech, right? And then he dies. So people start being more skeptical about the intelligentsia. One thing, since we have some time and I don't see many questions or any questions, unless there are questions now, one trend, Gabriele? No. One trend that has changed a lot is is how we use Plato. I mentioned Guthrie. Gabriele helped me to point out that Guthrie is British, so he thinks of the sophists through British English philosophy. But he also thinks of the sophists through Plato. And you have excellent studies like Tell's Plato's Counterfeit Sophists, which put into context why Plato is not a good source. Billings and Christopher Moore is a very recent companion to the sophists through Cambridge University Press. Gagarin's antiphon, Oratory, Law, and Justice in the Age of the Sophists, draws attention to the playfulness that the sophists could afford to cultivate, not being responsible for the choices for what people would decide in politics. And think about Socrates' trial again. Another thing that made Socrates face this trial was that he had taught people like Alcibiades. So there is this worry that what happens with your students, Plato tells his own story about Socrates, which is a very interesting story. The sophists are not there to say anything, but apparently they could afford not to care. And they could also afford to themselves teach useless things. I mean, mathematics, which is what Plato says only philosophers do, is what Antiphon does also. And you see that in the fragments, you see that in what Protagoras says about when he accuses the others of bringing everyone back to the technai. So they could afford to be playful. They could afford to use argumentation as exercise, like Antiphon's tetralogies, different scenarios about defending a case. And this was part of decent job description, at least not less decent than the philosophers, who were completely useless also. Yes, the last one is my own Perfect and Pleonectane, which I already mentioned.
Chloe,
yeah.
May I just ask you something, maybe on this note? So, what about this idea that the sophists were more public intellectuals when compared with Socrates and Plato Academy, for example, and even Aristotle?
Yes.
So this kind of
yes,
publicity
thank you. Some of them, I'm sure, were, and you see that also, exactly, you see this in Plato's dialogues. I just said we should not rely on that. But I guess some things that have to do with the dramatic setting mean something that we can use. Gorgias comes and people are going there and are trying to meet him, right? Influencers, exactly, influencers. Performances. They do antilogiae, and there is a marvelous text in the beginning of the Hippocratic treatise on the nature of man, which talks about those who are used to going to performances of debates. So it was not just to win a case. That's what you get through Aristophanes. It is to cultivate your ability to judge. And this is very important. And this is something I admire actually in lawyers, because they do have and they need that. And that's not because you're a host, but also because of that. I'm kidding. You need a really strong analytic ability. You need to know what the words mean. Even if you are not able to define them completely, which you also need to now, you have to make the distinctions that Prodicus, we know, cultivated. And if you think of a society where each male individual, citizen, was potentially a judge, that's something that gave you the honor, or I guess the conscience, of judging properly. You needed language to judge with, and the Greek word for language is logos, which we translate as reason, which we translate as speech, which we connect with rhetoric, but it's the same word. And it is the word that Xenophon says the art of logo is what Socrates also taught. Except when Socrates comes, he says, yes, but it is about the psyche, it is about the association with the human being, and I think I'm very sympathetic to that when I reconstruct what Socrates was about, that he harassed young men who didn't yet had not become citizens yet, and suggested that you cannot just go with all the, I'm thinking of Alcibiades now and your expertise on this, with all this narcissism and just don't care what you defend, which is how we think of Alcibiades. But no, you need to get rid of everything that is wrong, and that's what Socrates does with his midwifery. It's not about bringing out the truth, but about practicing abortions. And this is something that we find in Aristophanes, so it could be Socratic also, that the idea of, getting rid of, yes. Yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you for the lecture. I have a question. May I come back to the Sisyphus fragment?
The Sisyphus fragment, it's like toward the end.
It's really a very interesting fragment.
Yeah. More. Here, yes, yes.
So, the idea of an original state of human nature, would you agree that this position, this view on the human nature is more or less the same view of the human nature that we find in the antiphons fragment of the B44A of the papyrus of Oxyrhynchus, and also the position of Callicles and Gorgias?
No, I don't. I think that it is only in Callicles that we find this position. I think the direction, the focus of this text is completely different. He just talks about people being randomly bad or good. He doesn't care about that. He doesn't have a theory about what human nature is. If someone has an early theory about what human nature is, this is, I think, Protagoras, who talks about human nature as political. When you go to Antiphon, there we can disagree, but my opinion is, and that's why I refer to Gagarin's way of looking at Antiphon as a playful, open-ended treatise that talks about things from the part of nature, from the side of nature, and things from the side of law, and maybe also problematizing the law as something that justice can be reduced to. Of course, you have this fragment that justice is respecting the laws of the city where you live, right? But this is a fragment, and it could be, if you read all the fragments, where he talks about how can you betray your friend when you are a witness in the court, and what would. So it's full of paradoxes and dilemmas and antinomies that you face when you think of justice or morality as something that is brought to you through laws, whereas there is education, there is conscience, which is a later concept maybe, but it is not just about laws which change all the time. And you do see, that's another interesting point in the historiography of the sophists. Apparently, there is this tendency, this practice of changing laws or passing laws that will help the democracy, is something that make people more and more suspicious toward laws. And someone like Antiphon, who is, if we take Gagarin's at least reading, and if we think of Thucydides, and if it's the same Antiphon, as a very decent man, I don't think he's likely to be saying is that when people don't look at you, you should follow nature. And we will go back to this tomorrow, I think, but there is also this text from Aristotle where he talks about nature in Antiphon and bearing the bed and what nature is about. And the notion of nature is as important in this tradition and as something that needs to be defined as nomos is. So I don't think it's that simple, and I wouldn't think that Antiphon is anticipating Callicles' argument. I think that only Plato gives you this, in a similar way as Protagoras, if the Anonymous Iamblici is Protagoras, says that some people can argue this, but we need to resist that. And justice cannot really be just what laws say. The man who argues that this is actually possible is Socrates in the Memorabilia, which is interesting because some people say, what kind of legal positivism this is. But you have to see it in context. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think it's so simple to... Thank you. The last one I don't know because we have three.
Hi, thanks for your lecture. And some people say that Socrates is a sophist also.
I'm sorry, can you speak up?
Some people say that Socrates is a sophist also.
Yes.
What do you think about it?
I'm skeptical about applying the term sophist anyway. So, yeah. Yeah, Aristophanes called him frontistes. Frontistes. I think before Plato, there is a question of nomenclature, and the terms are used very loosely. One middle ground answer could be that Plato, when he talks about noble sophistry, and he talks about how elenkos, which is what Socrates typically does, is the best kind of catharsis. He thinks of Socrates as a good sophist. Sophist being maybe the people who will not postulate another part of reality like the forms. But it is really very complicated, and I don't think it is a fruitful question. It is an interesting one, though. And it is interesting, and I believe that Plato also doesn't think of Socrates as a real philosopher, so he thinks of him as a bridge between the two, and something that he can remedy, Plato. There was another... But why did I see three, another? You also had the question? You had the question, yes. Okay. So, yes, please, and then...
No, it's just adding something to all those questions. I've been thinking from the very beginning of your lecture exactly what he says. But Plato says...
About Socrates.
Plato says that Socrates... He doesn't say, but he implies that Socrates is a sophist. And this happens, for example, in Protagoras, when Socrates and I forgot the name of the boy who was going with him. Hippocrates. They go to the house to see Protagoras, and the porteiro, the
doorman, the slave,
doorman
yes,
says,
yes. Another
we have
sophist.
too many sophists here now. We already have too many sophists. And this happens also in the sophists, the dialogue sophists, where Plato says, I was looking for the sophist, and I found the philosopher. So I think Plato himself implies that Socrates is a sophist. And it's very hard to distinguish the difference, to see the difference between the sophist and the philosopher, because the philosopher, as we understand philosopher today, didn't exist. It was being invented.
Yes, right.
So, I think this is a question, sometimes I think Plato is ironic when he describes Socrates, and I'm very skeptical about Plato's opinion, Plato's having really a good opinion about Socrates. And I've written some articles about
Okay,
it.
I want to know more about this. I'm sympathetic to that, I must say. I wouldn't go that far. And one thing that I believe differentiates Socrates from the sophists in the various representations we have is his commitment to the soul, which we only find in Gorgias, in a soul that is immortal. If we think that the Aristophanes' birds is grounds for something, that he's a seer also. I mean, he's not part of the Enlightenment, I think, as the sophists would be. So I think he's very unique, Socrates. And also this thing about the, if I may say so, the sexual harassment. I don't know any other sophist who was accused of that. Am I wrong? So also this question of the dialogue and of wanting to know your student's soul and not caring so much about the body and the symposium and all that, I think reflects something that was typically Socratic and very interesting and unique.
Bom, talvez a gente pudesse continuar essa discussão amanhã, porque a professora vai estar aqui amanhã, na quinta, na sexta, e convidar todos e a professora Chloe para um coquetel de abertura. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Chloe,
thank you.
Excellent.
O coquetel acho que é aqui.
É aqui do lado.
Podem
o coquetel
trazer.
é aqui do lado.
Queria agradecer antes do coquetel a equipe maravilhosa que está trabalhando aqui para nós, em nome da Cristiane, que é essa moça aí. Muito obrigado, Cristiane. E queria agradecer à PUC, o Departamento de Filosofia da PUC, pela generosidade do coquetel que está sendo oferecido para nós, para fazermos festa para que estamos juntos e juntas.